Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight we drift into a yokai story. Lost in a snowstorm and about to collapse, a lone traveler sees a woman in white on the snow, a yokai with a gentle voice and a long-held sorrow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's watching from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's story together. The wind howled like a wounded spirit through the narrow mountain pass, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and something darker, something ancient that had witnessed centuries of travelers who never returned home. Kenji pulled his worn cloak tighter around his shoulders, feeling the first stinging bite of snow against his weathered cheeks. The path beneath his feet had long since disappeared under a blanket of white that seemed to swallow sound itself, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps and the endless moan of wind through the skeletal branches above. He should have listened to the old woman at the last village, her eyes clouded with cataracts and wisdom earned through decades of mountain winters. She had clutched his sleeve with fingers like gnarled roots, whispering warnings about the northern pass and the woman who walked there when the snow fell heaviest. But Kenji had dismissed her words as superstition, the fearful ramblings of a mind too long isolated from the wider world. Now, as darkness crept across the sky like spilled ink and the snow began to fall in earnest, he wondered if perhaps the old woman's fears held more truth than he had cared to admit. The merchant's pack on his back grew heavier with each step, the carefully wrapped bundles of silk and tea that represented months of careful trading now feeling like stones dragging him toward the earth. His breath came in white puffs that dissipated quickly in the frigid air, each exhalation a small rebellion against the cold that sought to claim him. The path, what little remained visible, wound upward through a forest of ancient pines whose branches drooped under the weight of accumulated snow, creating a tunnel of white silence that seemed to muffle even his thoughts. As twilight deepened into true darkness, the snow began to fall more heavily, each flake catching what little light remained and spinning it into brief, crystalline stars before vanishing into the growing drifts. Kenji's lantern, a simple paper construction with a flickering candle heart, cast dancing shadows that transformed every tree into a potential threat, every drift into a crouching figure. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally across his path and turning the world into a swirling maze of white and gray. It was then that he first heard it, a sound that might have been singing, or might have been merely the wind finding new voices among the mountain peaks. The melody, if it could be called such, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the storm like silver thread through dark cloth. It spoke of loneliness so profound, it had crystallized into something almost tangible, of winters that stretched beyond memory, of love lost to the hungry embrace of snow and time. Kenji paused, straining his ears against the wind, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving him to wonder if his mind, stressed by cold and exhaustion, had begun to play tricks on him. He pressed onward, each step now a conscious act of will against the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake in attempting this crossing so late in the season. The temperature continued to drop, turning his breath to ice crystals that clung to his mustache and beard, while his fingers grew numb despite the thick gloves his wife had knitted for him before his departure. The path, such as it was, led him through a grove of bamboo that rattled like dry bones in the wind, their hollow voices adding a percussion section to the mountain's symphony of desolation. Here the snow had drifted deep, forcing him to lift his legs high with each step, the effort sending shoots of exhaustion through muscles already pushed beyond their normal limits. His lantern flame guttered and nearly died, saved only by his cupped hand and a whispered prayer to whatever spirits might be listening. As he emerged from the bamboo grove, the landscape opened before him into a wide valley, its floor invisible beneath an unbroken expanse of snow that reflected the faint starlight like a frozen sea. On the far side, barely visible through the falling snow, he could make out the dark bulk of what might be a small shrine, or perhaps an abandoned hut. Shelter, regardless of its nature, and blessed relief from the wind that cut through his clothes as if they were made of rice paper. But between him and that distant promise of warmth lay a treacherous descent into the valley, and an equally challenging climb up the opposite slope. The snow here lay deep and unmarked, suggesting that he was perhaps the first person to attempt this crossing in weeks or even months. The realization brought with it a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If he were to fall here, to injure himself, or simply collapse from exhaustion, there would be no one to find him until the spring thaw revealed his bones to the mountain hawks. The singing came again, clearer now, and definitely not a trick of the wind. It rose and fell with the same rhythm as his labored breathing, a wordless lament that seemed to speak directly to some deep part of his soul that recognized sorrow when it heard it. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a longing so acute it made his chest tighten with sympathetic pain. Against all reason, he found himself drawn toward the sound, his feet carrying him down into the valley before his mind could fully process the decision to move. The snow here was even deeper than he had feared, reaching nearly to his waist in places and forcing him to wade rather than walk. Each step became a monumental effort, his legs burning with the strain, while sweat began to freeze against his skin beneath his layers of clothing. The singing grew stronger as he approached the center of the valley, its source still invisible, but definitely real now, too clear and present to be any product of his imagination. Halfway across the valley floor, exhaustion finally claimed him. His legs simply refused to take another step, buckling beneath him and sending him crashing face first into a drift that immediately began to soak through his clothes with its icy embrace. For a moment, he lay there, gasping, feeling the snow melt against his face and run in freezing rivulets down his neck. The singing had stopped abruptly, as if his fall had somehow interrupted the mysterious performer, leaving only the wind's lonely voice to fill the silence. It was then that he saw her. She stood perhaps 20 paces away, though the falling snow made distances difficult to judge, a figure of impossible grace and beauty that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was long and dark, falling in waves past her shoulders, and somehow untouched by the snow that continued to fall around her. Her skin was pale as fresh powder, with a translucent quality that suggested she was more spirit than flesh, while her eyes held depths that reminded him of frozen lakes, beautiful, but deadly to any who might break through their surface. She wore a kimono of pure white silk that seemed to shimmer and flow like liquid snow, its fabric somehow untouched by the storm that raged around them both. Her feet, he noticed with a shock that cut through his exhaustion, left no prints in the snow despite her obviously solid presence. She regarded him with an expression that might have been curiosity or hunger, or perhaps a mixture of both. Her head tilted slightly to one side like a bird studying an interesting insect. "You are far from home, traveler," she said, and her voice carried the same ethereal quality as her singing, each word crystallizing in the air between them before dissolving back into the storm. The mountain is no place for mortal men when winter claims its due. Kenji struggled to his knees, then to his feet, swaying slightly as exhaustion and awe warred within him. Every instinct screamed that he was in the presence of something far beyond his understanding, something that could end his life as easily as extinguishing a candle. Yet there was also something in her manner, a sadness that seemed to echo his own loneliness on this desolate mountain, that kept him from fleeing in terror. "I seek shelter," he managed to say through lips already growing numb from cold. "The storm came upon me more quickly than I expected." She studied him for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to look not just at him but through him, reading the contents of his soul like characters written in snow. When she finally moved, it was with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the deep drifts around her feet, gliding toward him with steps that made no sound and left no trace. "There is a place," she said softly, gesturing toward the dark structure he had glimpsed on the far side of the valley. "Old and forgotten, but it will keep the wind from your bones tonight." As she spoke, the storm began to intensify, the wind howling with renewed fury and driving the snow in stinging sheets that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The woman remained clearly visible, however, her pale form seeming to generate its own light that cut through the darkness like a blade through silk. "Come," she said, and though she spoke quietly, her voice carried easily over the storm's roar. The mountain does not often show mercy to those who challenge its domain. Tonight, perhaps, it remembers what it means to pity. She turned and began to glide away through the snow, moving with impossible speed, yet somehow never getting so far ahead that he lost sight of her ghostly figure. Kenji followed as best he could, struggling through drifts that seemed to part before her passage, but remained stubbornly deep for his own labored steps. His lungs burned with each breath of the frigid air, while his legs screamed in protest with every movement forward. The journey across the remainder of the valley passed in a dreamlike haze of white and gray, punctuated by the ethereal figure ahead of him who seemed to float rather than walk through the storm. Time lost all meaning in the swirling chaos of snow and wind, each step becoming its own small eternity of effort and pain. Yet somehow, impossibly, the dark structure on the far slope grew gradually larger and more defined, resolving itself into what appeared to be a small mountain shrine, its traditional architecture now partially buried under decades of accumulated snow and neglect. The woman paused at the entrance, a simple wooden door set beneath a peaked roof heavy with ice, and turned to face him with an expression that remained unreadable in the uncertain light. Snow continued to fall around her, but somehow none of the flakes seemed to land on her hair or clothing, passing through her as if she were made of mist rather than flesh. "Here you will find warmth and shelter from the storm," she said, her voice carrying notes of both promise and warning. "But know that the mountain takes payment for its mercies. Nothing comes without cost in this realm of ice and wind." Before Kenji could ask what she meant by payment, she had vanished, simply fading from sight like smoke dissipating in the wind. He stood alone before the shrine's entrance, the storm raging around him with undiminished fury, wondering if his exhausted mind had conjured the entire encounter from desperate hope and hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The door of the shrine opened at his touch, its ancient hinges protesting with a groan that seemed to echo through the storm-wrapped mountains. Inside, blessed darkness provided relief from the blinding whiteness outside, though the air remained cold enough to see his breath. Kenji stepped across the threshold, his frozen limbs moving stiffly as he pulled the door closed behind him, cutting off the wind's mournful voice and leaving him in sudden, profound silence. His lantern, somehow still flickering despite the ordeal outside, cast dancing shadows across the interior of what had once clearly been a place of worship. Wooden statues of forgotten kami stood in niches along the walls, their faces worn smooth by age and their painted features faded to ghostly suggestions of eyes and mouths. Paper screens, yellow with age and torn in places, divided the space into smaller chambers, while the scent of old incense still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the mustier odors of neglect and time. In the center of the main room, a small fire pit had been built from stones, and to Kenji's amazement, a pile of dry wood sat beside it, as if placed there specifically for his arrival. He approached cautiously, his wet clothes dripping steadily onto the wooden floor, and knelt to examine the wood more closely. It was weathered, but definitely combustible, cut and stacked with care that suggested recent human presence, despite the shrine's abandoned appearance. With trembling fingers, made clumsy by cold, he managed to coax his tinder into flame, and soon had a small fire crackling merrily in the stone circle. The warmth spread slowly through the small space, banishing the worst of the chill, and creating a circle of golden light that pushed back against the shadows clustered in the corners. For the first time since entering the mountain pass, Kenji allowed himself to believe that he might survive until morning. He arranged his wet outer garments near the fire to dry, then sat back on his heels to survey his temporary sanctuary more carefully. The shrine was larger than it had appeared from outside, with several chambers leading off from the main room and what appeared to be sleeping quarters in the back. Scroll paintings hung on the walls, their subjects nearly invisible after years of fading, though he could make out suggestions of mountain landscapes and seasonal festivals from happier times. As the fire grew stronger and warmth began to seep back into his bones, exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. His eyelids grew heavy despite his efforts to remain alert, and his head began to nod forward toward his chest. The day's struggle through the snow had pushed his body beyond its limits, and now that he was finally warm and safe, the accumulated fatigue demanded its due. He was just beginning to drift off when he heard it again, the singing from outside, but clearer now and definitely coming from somewhere within the shrine itself. His eyes snapped open and he looked around wildly, but the shadows cast by his fire revealed nothing beyond the ancient religious artifacts and faded decorations. The melody was the same haunting lament he had heard in the valley, wordless but filled with such profound sadness that it seemed to reach directly into his chest and squeeze his heart. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the large space. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped immediately, cut off as abruptly as if a door had been slammed shut. The silence that followed felt heavy and expectant, as if the very air were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Kenji remained perfectly still, straining his ears for any sound that might indicate another presence, but heard only the distant howl of wind outside and the soft crackling of his fire. After several minutes of tense waiting, he began to relax again, convinced that the singing had been nothing more than wind finding voice through some crack in the shrine's walls. The storm outside certainly seemed capable of producing any number of strange sounds, and his exhausted mind might well be interpreting natural phenomena as something more mysterious. He settled back against his pack, using it as a makeshift pillow, and closed his eyes once more. This time he managed to doze for what felt like several hours, his body finally claiming the rest it desperately needed, His dreams were strange and fragmented, filled with images of snow-covered landscapes and a pale woman who danced just beyond the edge of vision, always beckoning him to follow but never quite close enough to touch. In the dreams, her singing seemed to come from everywhere at once, weaving through the mountain peaks like silver thread through white silk. He woke to find his fire burned down to glowing embers and the shrine considerably colder than before. The storm outside had not abated. If anything, it sounded even fiercer than when he had first taken shelter, with wind that rattled the old building's frame and sent occasional puffs of snow through gaps in the walls. His breath once again formed visible clouds in the frigid air, while his extremities had begun to grow numb despite the shelter. As he moved to add more wood to the fire, he noticed something that made him freeze in place. There, in the dust on the floor beside the fire pit, were footprints that had definitely not been there when he fell asleep. They were small and delicate, clearly made by a woman's bare feet, and they led from the main entrance across to where he lay sleeping, then back again to disappear near one of the paper screens that divided the rear chambers. The prints were perfectly clear and undoubtedly fresh, pressed into the dust with a precision that could not have been caused by wind or settling debris. More disturbing still, they showed no signs of the moisture that should have accompanied anyone entering from the storm outside. The feet that made them had been completely dry, leaving crisp impressions without the slightest smudge or blur that melting snow would have created. Kenji's heart began to beat faster as he studied the tracks, following their path with his eyes while his mind raced through possible explanations. Could there be another traveler sheltering in the shrine's back chambers? Someone who had been here before his arrival and had emerged while he slept? But that explanation failed to account for the dry prints or the silent approach. Surely anyone moving around in the same space would have made some sound loud enough to wake him. "Hello?" he called again, more loudly this time. "I know someone is here. Please, I mean no harm. I'm just a traveler seeking shelter from the storm." His words echoed slightly in the shrine's main chamber, but no answer came. The silence stretched on, broken only by the storm's continued fury outside and the soft hiss of wood beginning to catch flame as his rebuilt fire grew stronger. Yet somehow, that silence felt occupied, as if invisible ears were listening to his every word and unseen eyes were studying his every movement. He rose slowly to his feet, taking his lantern from where it sat beside his pack, and began to follow the footprints toward the back of the shrine. The shadows seemed to press closer as he moved away from the fire's warmth, while the paper screens cast dancing patterns that transformed familiar objects into grotesque shapes at the edge of his vision. The footprints led him past several small chambers that appeared empty, save for dust and forgotten religious implements, their floors scattered with dried leaves that had blown in through broken windows. At the rear of the shrine, the prints led to a larger chamber that might once have served as the priest's quarters. A raised platform at one end held the remains of what had been a bed, though only the wooden frame remained, its mattress and coverings long since claimed by mice and weather. Paper screens divided this room as well, creating smaller spaces for privacy and contemplation, while a small window looked out onto the storm-wrapped mountainside. It was here that the footprints ended, simply stopping in the middle of the room as if their maker had suddenly taken flight. Kenji held his lantern high, casting its light into every corner and behind every screen, but found no sign of another human presence. The dust beyond where the prints ended was undisturbed, showing no indication that anyone had continued walking in any direction. As he stood puzzling over this mystery, A sound from the main chamber made him spin around in alarm. Someone, or something, was moving near his fire, the soft footfalls clearly audible in the shrine's acoustic environment. He hurried back through the connecting chambers, his lantern flame dancing wildly with his rapid movement. But when he emerged into the main room, he found it apparently empty once again. His fire, however, had been carefully tended in his absence. Fresh wood had been added to the flames, arranged with the skill of someone long familiar with maintaining warmth through mountain winters. His drying clothes had been moved closer to the heat source to speed their drying, and his pack had been repositioned to serve as a better backrest for sleeping. Most unsettling of all, a small wooden bowl that he had not noticed before sat beside the fire, filled with what appeared to be hot tea that steamed gently in the cold air. The scent that rose from the bowl was delicate and complex, with notes of mountain herbs and something else he could not identify, something wild and clean that reminded him of snow-covered pine forests and frozen streams. Despite his growing unease, the warmth emanating from the tea was irresistibly appealing after his ordeal in the cold, and his throat ached with thirst that plain water could not fully satisfy. "Thank you," he said aloud, addressing the apparently empty room. "Whoever you are, I am grateful for your kindness." As if summoned by his words, the singing began again, but this time it came from directly beside him. He turned his head, and there she was, the pale woman from the valley, sitting gracefully beside his fire, as if she had been there all along. Her white kimono remained pristine and dry, despite the storm that continued to rage outside, while her dark hair fell in perfect waves that caught the firelight like black silk. "You are welcome, traveler," she said, her voice carrying the same ethereal quality he remembered. "The mountain is harsh to those who wander alone, but it is not without mercy for those who show proper respect." Up close, her beauty was even more striking and unsettling than it had appeared in the valley. Her skin held a luminous quality that seemed to come from within, while her eyes reflected the firelight in ways that suggested depths far greater than any mortal gaze should contain. When she moved, it was with fluid grace that made no sound and disturbed neither dust nor air around her. "Who are you?" Kenji asked, though part of him feared the answer. "What is this place?" She smiled then, an expression both beautiful and terrible that sent chills down his spine despite the fire's warmth. "I am many things to many people," she replied. "To some, I am salvation from the storm's embrace. To others, I am the storm itself. As for this place, it was once home to a priest who understood that the mountain spirits require recognition, require acknowledgement." Her words seemed to carry meanings beyond their simple surface, implications that made his skin crawl with premonition. Yet her manner remained gentle, almost motherly, as she gestured toward the steaming bowl beside him. "Drink," she said softly. "The tea will restore warmth to your bones and strength to your spirit. The night is long yet, and the storm shows no signs of mercy." Kenji lifted the bowl with hands that trembled only slightly, inhaling the fragrant steam that rose from its surface. The scent was even more intoxicating up close, promising warmth and comfort beyond anything he had experienced in days of cold travel. Yet something in the woman's expectant expression, in the way she watched his every movement with those impossible eyes, gave him pause. "What payment do you require?" he asked, remembering her words from outside. "You said nothing comes without cost in this realm." Her smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too perfect for any mortal woman. "Perceptive," she murmured approvingly. "The mountain has indeed taught you wisdom in its embrace. The payment I require is simple: memory. Tell me of the world beyond these peaks, of warmth and life and love. Share with me what it means to walk in sunlight, to feel spring rain on living skin." The request seemed innocent enough, yet something in her tone suggested deeper hungers lurking beneath the surface. Still, the tea's warmth called to him, and his body craved the restoration it promised. After a moment's hesitation, he lifted the bowl to his lips and drank deeply of the mysterious brew. Warmth spread through him immediately, starting in his chest and radiating outward to his extremities with an intensity that bordered on euphoria. The exhaustion that had weighed on his limbs for hours began to lift, replaced by a sense of vitality and strength that he had not felt since beginning his mountain crossing. Even his wet clothes seemed to be drying faster, steam rising from the fabric as if heated by some internal fire. "Tell me," the woman whispered, settling more comfortably beside the fire, "of your home, of those who wait for your return." And so, warmed by mysterious tea and hypnotized by her otherworldly presence, Kenji began to speak of his life in the valley below, of his wife who tended their small garden with patient hands, of the children who played in their village streets, of festivals and harvests and all the small joys that made up a human existence. As he talked, the woman listened with an intensity that seemed to draw the words from him, her pale eyes never leaving his face while her expression grew increasingly wistful. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but within the shrine's walls, time seemed to slow and stretch like honey poured in winter. The fire burned with steady warmth that never seemed to consume its fuel, while the woman's presence filled the space with an energy that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. As the night wore on, Kenji found himself sharing memories he had not thought of in years, stories from his childhood and dreams he had harbored but never spoken aloud. With each tale, the woman seemed to grow more solid, more present, as if his words were feeding something essential within her pale form. Her beauty, already striking, became almost overwhelming to look upon directly, while her voice, when she occasionally asked questions or made soft comments, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his very bones. It was only when he noticed that his reflection in her eyes showed not his current adult self, but the child he had once been, that Kenji began to understand the true nature of the payment she required. She was not simply listening to his memories. She was taking them, drawing them out of him like water from a well, adding them to some internal collection that sustained her existence in this realm of ice and solitude. The realization crept over Kenji slowly, like frost forming on a window pane. As he continued to share his memories with the pale woman, he began to notice gaps appearing in his recollection. Small things at first, like the name of his childhood dog or the exact color of his mother's favorite kimono. The missing pieces were subtle enough that he might have attributed them to simple forgetfulness, but their absence created hollow spaces in his mind that echoed with loss. The woman noticed his growing unease, her ethereal features shifting into an expression of gentle concern that somehow made her appear even more beautiful and terrible. "You grow troubled, traveler," she observed, her voice carrying notes of sympathy that sounded genuine despite the growing certainty that she was stealing pieces of his very soul. "The storm outside mirrors the tempest in your heart." Kenji set down the wooden bowl, its contents now cool despite the fire's continued warmth, and studied her face for signs of the hunger he was beginning to perceive lurking beneath her compassionate facade. "What are you taking from me?" he asked directly. "These memories, they're disappearing as I speak them." She tilted her head slightly, like a bird considering a question of particular complexity. "I take nothing that is not freely given," she replied. "You came to my mountain seeking shelter from the storm, and I have provided what you requested. In return, you share with me the experiences I can never have, the warmth of human connection that was stolen from me long ago." As she spoke, the fire between them flickered and dimmed, its flames taking on a bluish cast that threw strange shadows on the shrine's ancient walls. The temperature in the room began to drop, despite the continued presence of burning wood, while frost began to form along the edges of the paper screens that divided the space. "Long ago?" Kenji repeated, pulling his partially dry cloak closer around his shoulders as the cold crept back into his bones. "How long have you been here?" Her laugh was like ice crystals falling on stone, beautiful and sharp and utterly without warmth. "Time means little in this place," she said. "Seasons come and go, storms rage and pass, travelers occasionally find their way to my domain. But for me, there is only the eternal winter of isolation, broken by rare moments when someone like you brings me glimpses of the world I lost." She rose then, moving with that same impossible grace, and began to pace around the fire pit. With each step, the temperature dropped further, until Kenji's breath once again formed white clouds in the air, and ice began to form in the bowl that had held the mysterious tea. "I was not always as you see me now," she continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic, hypnotic quality that made it difficult to focus on anything except her words. "Once, I knew warmth as you do. I felt the sun on my face, the touch of loving hands, the joy of children's laughter. I had a name then, a family, a life that stretched before me like a path through summer meadows." As she spoke, images began to form in the air around her, translucent scenes that shimmered like heat mirages despite the growing cold. Kenji saw a young woman, beautiful but clearly mortal, tending to children in a mountain village not unlike his own. She moved with life and energy, her cheeks flushed with health and happiness, her eyes bright with love for the small ones who clustered around her seeking comfort and guidance. "Yuki was my name then," the pale woman said, and the sound of it seemed to cause her visible pain. "I was a nursemaid to the village children, a keeper of stories and songs, a tender of small hurts and fears. The mountains were my home, but they held no terror for me then. They were simply the walls of my world, beautiful and protective." The images shifted, showing the same village but in the grip of winter's harshest embrace. Snow fell in sheets so thick they obscured everything beyond a few feet, while wind howled through the streets with voices that sounded almost human in their anguish. The young woman who had been Yuki moved through the storm, a lantern in her hand and desperate purpose in her step. "The blizzard came without warning," she continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. "The worst storm in living memory," they said later. Children were trapped in the schoolhouse when the roof began to collapse under the weight of snow. I went to help them, to lead them to safety, through paths I knew by heart, even in the worst weather." Kenji watched in horrified fascination as the images played out the tragedy, saw Yuki guiding a line of small children through the storm, her lantern barely penetrating the wall of falling snow, her voice raised in encouraging songs that were almost immediately lost in the wind's roar. He saw her stumble as a particularly fierce gust extinguished her light, saw her fall face first into a drift that immediately began to bury her, saw the children clustering around her in terror as the storm closed in around them all. "I led them into the mountains," she said, her ethereal form now wreathed in swirling snow that seemed to emanate from her very skin. Away from the collapsed building, toward what I thought was safety. But the storm was too strong, the cold too fierce. One by one, the children began to falter. One by one, they fell behind despite my desperate efforts to keep them together. The images showed her carrying first one child, then two, then attempting impossibly to bear 3 small forms through snow that reached above her waist. Her face, once flushed with life and health, grew pale with exhaustion and hypothermia, while her movements became increasingly uncoordinated as the cold sapped her strength. When I could no longer carry them all, I made a choice, she whispered, tears now streaming down her cheeks, tears that froze solid before they could fall more than an inch from her eyes. I dug a cave in the snow, sheltered them as best I could, and went for help. I promised them I would return, that I would bring warmth and rescue and safety. Kenji felt his own tears beginning to freeze on his face as he watched the final, most heartbreaking scene unfold in the shimmering images around them. He saw Yuki struggling through the storm, her strength failing with each step, her desperate attempts to find help in a world turned white and hostile. He saw her collapse just yards from the village edge, her body overcome by the very cold she had tried so hard to defy. "I died in that storm," she said simply, her voice now carrying the hollow echo of wind through empty spaces. "Froze to death mere moments before the rescue party found me, and when I opened my eyes again, I was this, neither living nor dead, bound to these mountains by guilt and sorrow, sustained only by the warmth I can steal from others." The images faded, leaving only the pale woman standing in the growing cold of the shrine, her white kimono now clearly revealed as a burial shroud, her ethereal beauty the terrible perfection of death preserved in ice. The fire between them had dwindled to barely glowing embers, while frost covered every surface in the ancient building. "The children?" Kenji managed to ask through lips growing numb with cold. Her expression crumpled with anguish so profound, it seemed to pull the very warmth from the air around them. Found 3 days later, frozen in their snow cave, all 7 of them, huddled together as I had left them, still waiting for the rescue that never came. Their deaths weighed on my spirit like stones in deep water, dragging me down into this existence between worlds. The temperature continued to plummet as her grief intensified, turning the shrine into a tomb of ice and shadow. Kenji's breath came in short, sharp puffs, while his extremities began to lose feeling despite his attempts to keep moving. The woman who had been Yuki seemed unaware of the effect her presence was having, lost in the retelling of her tragedy. "For decades, I have wandered these peaks," she continued, her voice now accompanied by the sound of wind howling through mountain passes, drawing travelers into my web of sorrow, feeding on their memories of warmth and life to sustain this cursed existence. Each story shared, each moment of happiness stolen, grants me a few more years of this hollow immortality. Kenji realized with growing horror that he was experiencing exactly what she described. More memories were slipping away even as she spoke, his wedding day now reduced to fragments of sensation without context, his children's faces becoming increasingly blurred and indistinct. She was consuming his past to fuel her endless winter, leaving him with gaps in his identity that grew larger with each passing moment. "But you're taking everything," he protested weakly, his voice barely audible over the supernatural wind that had begun to swirl through the shrine. "If you continue, there will be nothing left of who I am." She turned to face him then, her pale eyes reflecting a sorrow so deep it seemed to contain all the winter nights that had ever been. "I know," she whispered, "and I am sorry for it. But the hunger is too strong, the loneliness too vast. I cannot stop myself from taking what you offer, any more than fire can choose not to burn or snow can choose not to fall." As if summoned by her words, snow began to fall inside the shrine itself, drifting down from the rafters in impossible defiance of physics and reason. Each flake that touched Kenji's skin carried with it a numbing cold that went beyond the physical, reaching directly into his spirit to freeze the connections between thought and memory, between self and identity. "There must be another way," he said desperately, struggling to his feet despite legs that felt like wooden posts. "Some way to end your suffering without destroying everyone who seeks shelter from the storm." She laughed again, that same crystalline sound, but now it carried notes of genuine surprise. "In all my years of wandering, you are the first to concern yourself with my pain rather than your own survival. Most travelers beg and plead for their lives, promising anything if only I will spare them. But you would help me find peace?" The snow falling around them began to slow as she spoke, while the supernatural wind that had been tearing through the shrine gentled to barely a whisper. For a moment, hope flickered in Kenji's chest, like a candle flame in the darkness. "Tell me what you need," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the cold that was slowly stealing his ability to speak. "There must be something that can free you from this curse, some way to find the rest you seek." Yuki-onna, for that was clearly what she had become, the legendary snow woman of mountain folklore, moved closer to him, her ethereal form seeming to solidify slightly as she considered his words. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been hope, though fragile as winter morning ice. "There is one possibility," she said slowly, as if afraid that speaking the words aloud might make them untrue. "The old priest who once tended this shrine spoke of it before he died. A ritual of release, a way to transfer the burden of guilt from one soul to another, freely given and willingly accepted." Kenji felt his heart skip a beat as the implications of her words sank in. "You mean take your place? Become what you are?" She nodded slowly, her pale features reflecting an agony of hope and despair. "The guilt that binds me to this existence could be shared, divided between two souls instead of crushing one alone. But the volunteer would take on part of my curse, would become partially what I am, neither fully alive nor completely dead, bound to these mountains, but not entirely consumed by their winter." The offer hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by a thread. Kenji understood that accepting would mean giving up his mortal life, his return to the warm valley below, his reunion with the family whose faces were already growing dim in his failing memory. Yet he also saw in Yuki-onna's expression a suffering so profound that it made his own losses seem insignificant by comparison. "What would happen to you?" he asked. "If I agreed to share this burden?" "I would finally be able to move on," she replied, tears of ice continuing to fall from her luminous eyes. The weight of 7 children's deaths, carried for so long alone, would be lightened enough for my spirit to find rest. I could go to whatever realm awaits those who die in service to others, instead of being trapped forever in this liminal space between life and death. As she spoke, more images began to form around them. Not memories this time, but visions of what could be. Kenji saw himself transformed, his mortal flesh taking on some of her ethereal qualities while retaining enough humanity to find peace in the arrangement. He would become a guardian of the mountains, protecting travelers from the worst storms while carrying only a portion of the guilt that had consumed her for so long. But you would be giving up everything, she continued, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was asking. Your life, your family, your future in the world below. Is the suffering of one cursed spirit worth such a sacrifice? Kenji closed his eyes and tried to summon the faces of his wife and children, but found them growing increasingly indistinct as Yuki-onna's presence continued to drain his memories. Soon, he realized, he might not remember enough of his old life to mourn its loss. Perhaps that would make the choice easier, but it would also make it meaningless. A decision made by someone who was no longer truly himself. I need to decide now, he said aloud, opening his eyes to meet her pale gaze. Before I lose too much of who I am to make the choice freely. She nodded, understanding the terrible urgency of the situation. Around them, the shrine had become a crystalline palace of ice and snow, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The fire had gone out completely, leaving only the otherworldly light that emanated from Yuki-onna's form to illuminate their surroundings. Know this, she said softly. If you choose to help me, the transformation cannot be undone. You will be bound to these mountains as I am, though with more freedom to find joy in your existence. You will remember this choice and why you made it, but much of your mortal life will fade like smoke in winter wind. Kenji thought of the 7 children who had died waiting for rescue that never came, of the young woman who had sacrificed her life trying to save them, of decades of endless guilt and supernatural hunger that had twisted love into something monstrous. He thought of other travelers who would face the same choice he faced now, and of the suffering that would continue if nothing changed. I accept, he said simply, his voice carrying across the frozen shrine with surprising strength. I choose to share your burden willingly, to help you find the peace you deserve. The effect was immediate and profound. Light blazed from Yuki-onna's form, not the cold illumination she had previously emanated, but something warm and golden that filled the shrine with radiance like captured sunlight. The ice and snow that had transformed their shelter began to melt, running in streams across the wooden floor, while the temperature rose to comfortable levels for the first time since her true nature had been revealed. Kenji felt the change beginning in his own body, a tingling sensation that started in his extremities and spread inward, carrying with it a coolness that was not unpleasant, but definitely inhuman. His reflection in the melting ice showed features that were becoming more ethereal, more otherworldly, though still recognizably his own. Thank you, Yuki-onna whispered, and her voice now carried notes of joy that transformed her terrible beauty into something transcendent. You have given me the greatest gift possible, the chance to rest at last. As she spoke, her form began to fade, becoming translucent and then nearly invisible. But her expression was peaceful now, free of the anguish that had defined her existence for so long. She looked, Kenji realized, like someone finally going home after a journey that had lasted far too long. The children will be waiting for me, she said, her voice growing distant as her spirit prepared to depart. I can see them now, no longer cold or afraid. They forgive me, as I must finally learn to forgive myself." And then she was gone, vanishing like smoke in sunlight, leaving behind only a sense of profound peace and the lingering scent of mountain flowers in spring. Kenji stood alone in the shrine, changed but not destroyed, carrying within himself a portion of her ancient sorrow, but also the strength to bear it with greater grace than she had managed alone. Dawn broke over the mountains with unusual clarity, the storm having finally exhausted itself during the night's supernatural events. Kenji, though he was no longer entirely the man who had sought shelter in the shrine, stood at the entrance watching sunlight paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The beauty of the scene struck him with an intensity he had never experienced as a mortal, every crystalline surface reflecting light in patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. His transformation had been profound, but not complete. While he retained his essential humanity and most of his memories, he could feel the difference in his very bones, a coolness that would never fully leave him, an awareness of the mountain's moods and needs that whispered constantly at the edge of his consciousness. He was no longer entirely mortal, but neither was he the tormented spirit that Yuki-onna had become. The guilt he carried was real and weighty, the accumulated sorrow of 7 children who had died in the snow, the anguish of their families, the tragedy of a young woman's sacrifice twisted into something monstrous by decades of self-recrimination. But it was a burden shared now, divided between his spirit and the peaceful rest that Yuki-onna had finally found, and therefore bearable in a way it had not been for her alone. As he watched the sunrise, Kenji became aware of movement in the valley below. A group of travelers, bundled heavily against the cold, were making their way up the mountain path he had followed the night before. Their progress was slow and labored, and even from this distance he could see that they were struggling against the deep snow and treacherous footing that the storm had left in its wake. Without conscious thought, he found himself moving toward them, his feet carrying him down the mountainside with a speed and grace that would have been impossible in his purely human form. The snow parted before him like water, while his steps left only the faintest impressions on the pristine surface. He moved like wind across the drifts, covering ground that should have taken hours to traverse in mere minutes. The travelers, a merchant family by their appearance, with pack animals and children bundled in thick furs, looked up in amazement as he approached. Their fear was evident in their faces, for his transformation had given him an otherworldly appearance that marked him as something beyond normal human experience. Yet there was kindness in his expression and warmth in his smile that reassured them, even as they marveled at his supernatural grace. "The path ahead is treacherous," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the thin mountain air. "The storm has shifted the drifts and hidden the safe routes. Allow me to guide you to shelter." The merchant, a middle-aged man whose weathered face spoke of many years of mountain travel, studied him with the cautious eyes of one who had heard the old stories. "You are the guardian of this place?" he asked carefully. "The one the villages below speak of in whispers." Kenji considered the question, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones like cold settling into stone. "I am," he replied simply, "and I offer you protection from the mountain's dangers, freely given with no payment required but courtesy and respect for the spirits that dwell here." It was the first of many such encounters over the weeks and months that followed. Word spread quickly through the valley communities that the northern pass, long considered deadly to all but the most experienced mountain climbers, was now protected by a benevolent spirit who guided travelers safely through its perils. Kenji found purpose in this role, a way to transform the guilt he carried into something positive and life-affirming. He made his home in the ancient shrine, restoring it gradually with materials that seemed to appear as needed, wood that had seasoned perfectly despite being freshly cut, stones that fit together with impossible precision, paper screens that somehow remained untorn despite the mountain winds. The building became a beacon of safety for those caught in storms, always warm and welcoming, always stocked with supplies that renewed themselves through means he never questioned. As seasons turned and years passed, Kenji learned to navigate his new existence with increasing skill. He could appear as solid and human as any mortal when travelers needed comfort and reassurance, or fade to near invisibility when his presence might frighten those not ready to accept the supernatural. His connection to the mountain allowed him to predict weather patterns days in advance, to sense avalanche conditions before they became dangerous, to find lost travelers no matter how far they had strayed from safe paths. The guilt remained, a constant ache in his transformed heart, but it no longer consumed him as it had consumed Yuki-onna. Instead, it motivated him to prevent other tragedies, to ensure that no more children would die lost in storms, no more rescuers would perish in the attempt to save lives. Each person he guided to safety was a small redemption, a step toward balancing the scales of that ancient tragedy. He learned, too, that he was not entirely alone in his vigil. Other spirits dwelt in the high places, some benevolent, some neutral, a few actively malicious, and part of his role became mediating between these supernatural forces and the human travelers who unknowingly entered their domain. He developed relationships with the kami of particular peaks and valleys, earning their respect through his dedication to protecting both their territory and the mortals who passed through it. Sometimes, on nights when the wind howled with voices that sounded almost human, Kenji would think he heard Yuki-onna's singing carried on the storm, but these were peaceful melodies now, lullabies for lost souls rather than laments for the dead. He took comfort in believing that she had found her way to whatever realm awaited those who died in service to others, reunited at last with the children she had tried so desperately to save. The merchant family he had first encountered became regular travelers on his route, their initial fear transforming over time into respectful friendship. Their children grew up knowing stories of the mountain guardian who had saved their family from the storm, and some of them would eventually become merchants and guides themselves, passing down the knowledge of safe passage through the peaks, along with tales of the supernatural protector who watched over all who showed proper respect. Years blended into decades as Kenji's vigil continued. He watched villages in the valleys below grow and change, saw new trade routes established and old ones abandoned, witnessed the slow transformation of the world as it moved from one era to another. Through it all, the mountains remained constant, eternal and unchanging in their essential nature, though the patterns of snow and wind shifted with the endless cycles of weather and season. His own nature stabilized during this time, finding a balance between the human heart that remembered love and loss and the supernatural awareness that allowed him to fulfill his role as guardian. He could feel emotions as deeply as ever, but they no longer threatened to overwhelm him as they had in his early days of transformation. The guilt that had initially seemed unbearable became integrated into his identity, a source of strength rather than weakness. He began to understand why the old priest who had once tended the shrine had spoken of a ritual of sharing burden. This was not merely a way to escape supernatural punishment, but a recognition that some tragedies were too large for any single soul to bear alone. By dividing the weight between multiple spirits, the cosmos achieved a kind of balance that allowed healing to occur over time, rather than festering into the kind of consuming torment that had trapped Yuki-onna. The shrine itself seemed to respond to his care and attention, becoming more than just a shelter, but a true sanctuary where weary travelers could find not only physical refuge, but spiritual restoration. Pilgrims began to make special journeys to the site, seeking blessings for safe travel or offering prayers for loved ones who had been lost to mountain storms. Kenji welcomed them all, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds, understanding that his role transcended any particular religious tradition. As winter approached each year, he would feel the familiar stirring of ancient memories, not his own, but those he had inherited from Yuki-onna's long torment. The image of 7 children waiting in a snow cave for rescue that would never come remained vivid in his mind, a reminder of why his vigil mattered and why the burden he carried served a purpose beyond mere penance. But now, these memories came with a sense of completion rather than endless anguish. The children's deaths had meaning because they had led to a guardian who would prevent other such tragedies. Yuki-onna's suffering had purpose because it had created the supernatural awareness necessary to protect future travelers. Even his own sacrifice of mortal life contributed to a greater good that stretched across generations. On particularly clear nights, when the mountain air was so pure it seemed to magnify the stars, Kenji would climb to the highest peak within his domain and look out over the world spread below. The lights of distant villages twinkled like earthbound constellations, while rivers of trade and communication flowed between settlements in patterns that resembled the neural pathways of some vast living organism. From this perspective, he could see his role in the larger tapestry of existence, one thread among many, but an essential one that helped weave together the disparate elements of human civilization. The merchants who traveled safely through his passes carried goods and ideas that enriched distant communities. The pilgrims, who found spiritual solace at his shrine, returned to their homes with renewed faith and purpose. The children who grew up hearing stories of the mountain guardian learned that sacrifice and protection were virtues worth emulating. Time moved differently for Kenji now that he existed between the mortal and spirit worlds. Seasons still turned in their ancient rhythm, but years seemed to flow past, like water over stone, each one leaving its mark but not fundamentally altering the essential nature of his existence. He aged, but slowly and gracefully, his appearance settling into that of a man in his middle years who possessed the wisdom of centuries and the serene strength that came from accepting a burden willingly borne. The world beyond the mountains changed more rapidly than he had expected when he first accepted his supernatural role. Trade routes expanded and evolved as kingdoms rose and fell in the valleys below. New technologies appeared, better weapons, more efficient farming techniques, innovations in architecture and engineering that gradually transformed the villages he had once known into thriving towns and eventually small cities. Through it all, Kenji maintained his vigil, adapting his methods to serve travelers whose needs evolved with the changing times, while never abandoning the essential nature of his protective role. When bandits began to threaten merchant caravans on the mountain passes, he learned to manifest with enough physical power to drive them away without causing permanent harm. When new diseases spread along trade routes, he discovered ways to purify the water sources within his domain and provide healing herbs to those who sought his aid. His connection to the mountain deepened with each passing year until he could sense the approach of storms days in advance, feel the stress patterns in snow-loaded slopes that might trigger avalanches, and detect the presence of dangerous animals or hostile humans long before they posed a threat to travelers. This supernatural awareness came with its own form of responsibility, knowledge that demanded action, insights that required him to make difficult choices about when and how to intervene in the natural order. He learned to walk the delicate line between protection and interference, understanding that his role was to guard against preventable tragedies rather than to shield mortals from all forms of hardship. A merchant who lost goods to a sudden storm could recover and learn wisdom from the experience, but a family frozen to death in a blizzard left only grief and loss in their wake. His interventions focused on preserving life while allowing the mountain to teach its own harsh lessons about preparation, respect, and humility. The shrine that served as his base became a nexus of supernatural activity, attracting not only human travelers, but spirits from across the mountain range who recognized him as a stabilizing influence in their chaotic realm. He mediated disputes between territorial kami, negotiated safe passage agreements with the more volatile entities that haunted certain peaks, and gradually built a network of supernatural allies who shared his commitment to protecting mortal travelers. Some of these spirits had their own tragic origins. A warrior who had died defending a village from raiders and now stood eternal watch over a particular valley. A mother who had lost her children to plague and dedicated her afterlife to protecting other families from disease. A priest who had sacrificed himself to contain a malevolent force and continued his sacred duties from beyond the grave. In their company, Kenji found a community of understanding that helped ease the isolation of his transformed existence. The guilt he carried, that echo of Yuki-onna's ancient anguish, evolved over time from a source of constant pain into something more like a compass that guided his actions. The memory of 7 children dying in the snow remained vivid, but it was accompanied now by the recollection of hundreds of travelers he had guided to safety, dozens of families he had reunited, countless small acts of protection and kindness that gradually tipped the scales toward redemption. He began to understand that the ritual of burden sharing had been designed not merely to distribute suffering, but to transform it into something constructive. The guilt that had driven Yuki-onna to consume the memories and warmth of others now motivated him to preserve and protect those same qualities in the living. What had been a curse of endless hunger became a blessing of endless service. As the decades accumulated into centuries, Kenji witnessed changes that would have been inconceivable to his mortal mind. The wooden shrines and simple mountain huts of his early years gave way to more elaborate structures built with techniques and materials that spoke of increasing prosperity in the regions below. Travelers began to carry goods he had never seen before: exotic spices from distant lands, fabrics woven with threads of precious metals, books filled with knowledge from across the known world. Yet for all the surface changes, the essential human elements remained constant: fear and courage, love and loss, hope and despair. These emotions resonated through every generation with the same fundamental frequencies. A mother's anxiety for her child's safety in the mountain passes felt identical whether she lived in his original century or one far in the future. A merchant's relief at finding shelter in a storm carried the same emotional weight regardless of what goods filled his pack or what innovations had shaped his world. This continuity of human experience became one of Kenji's greatest sources of comfort during the long years of his vigil. Though he had sacrificed his mortal existence, he remained connected to the stream of human feeling that flowed through his domain like an underground river. Each interaction with travelers reminded him of who he had been and why he had chosen to become what he was. The seasonal rhythms of the mountains provided another form of stability that anchored his existence. Spring brought the excitement of travelers eager to attempt crossings after winter's isolation. along with the anxiety of knowing that late-season storms could still prove deadly to the unprepared. Summer brought the busiest period of trade and pilgrimage, when the passes filled with caravans and individual travelers taking advantage of the most favorable weather. Autumn carried its own tensions as people rushed to complete their journeys before winter closed the high routes, often taking dangerous risks to avoid the delays that might strand them in the valleys until spring. And winter brought the deep solitude that Kenji had learned to treasure. Months when only the most desperate or experienced travelers attempted the mountain crossings, when he could focus on maintaining his sanctuary and deepening his connection to the supernatural forces that shared his domain. Each season brought its own forms of beauty that his enhanced senses allowed him to appreciate with an intensity that had been impossible during his mortal life. Spring's first flowers pushing through the snow seemed to glow with inner light, while summer's alpine meadows revealed colors so vivid they bordered on the supernatural. Autumn's changing leaves created tapestries of incredible complexity, and winter's snow sculptures formed patterns that spoke to something deeper than mere aesthetic appreciation. He began to understand why so many spirits chose to bind themselves to particular locations rather than moving on to whatever realms awaited the deceased. The natural world possessed its own form of consciousness, a slow-moving but profound awareness that responded to attention and care. By dedicating himself to protecting a specific region, he had become part of something larger, a guardian system that stretched across continents and cultures, maintaining the balance between human ambition and natural law. The stories told about him in the villages below evolved over time, each generation adding its own embellishments and interpretations to the core narrative of the mountain guardian who protected travelers from storm and avalanche. Some versions portrayed him as a stern judge who punished those who showed disrespect to the mountains, while others emphasized his compassionate nature and willingness to help even the most foolhardy adventurers. All of the stories contained elements of truth, but none captured the full complexity of his existence, the way supernatural duty intertwined with human emotion, how ancient guilt transformed into present purpose, the delicate balance between intervention and acceptance that defined his role. He found these limitations amusing rather than frustrating, understanding that mortal minds needed simple narratives to comprehend forces that existed beyond their normal experience. Occasionally, travelers would arrive at his shrine already knowing something of his story, seeking not just physical shelter, but spiritual guidance. These encounters often proved the most challenging, as they required him to articulate insights that had developed through centuries of contemplation and experience. How could he explain the peace that came from accepting an impossible burden? How could he describe the satisfaction of serving others without expectation of reward or recognition? He learned to speak in parables and metaphors that resonated with his visitors' own experiences, drawing parallels between his supernatural existence and the everyday sacrifices that defined human relationships. A parent's willingness to go without food so that children could eat, a soldier's readiness to die protecting others, a healer's dedication to serving the sick despite personal risk. All of these contained echoes of the choice he had made, and the path he continued to follow. Through these conversations, Kenji gradually developed a deeper understanding of his own transformation. He had not simply taken on Yuki-onna's burden. He had consciously chosen to transform suffering into service, to channel ancient guilt into present protection. The ritual that had bound him to the mountains was not a punishment, but a consecration, marking him as someone who had chosen love over fear, service over self-preservation. This realization brought with it a profound sense of peace that settled into his bones like warmth settling into a cold room. The guilt remained, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it motivated him, reminding him daily of why his vigil mattered and why the sacrifices he had made served a purpose greater than his individual happiness. As he stood watch over his domain, feeling the pulse of life flowing through the mountain passes below, Kenji understood that he had found something many mortals spent their entire lives seeking, a sense of meaning that transcended personal desire, a role that connected him to something eternal and significant. The wind that whispered through the peaks carried voices of gratitude from those he had helped, while the stars that wheeled overhead seemed to acknowledge his service with their constant, patient light. In the deepest hours of the night, when even the most restless spirits settled into peaceful contemplation, Kenji would sometimes hear an echo of that song that had first drawn him to Yuki-onna's presence. But now, it was transformed, no longer a lament of endless sorrow, but a lullaby of eternal protection, a melody that promised safety to all who traveled the mountain paths, with respect and humility in their hearts. The sound carried on the wind like a blessing, reaching into the valleys below, where families slept peacefully, knowing that someone watched over the dangerous passes that connected their world to the wider realm beyond. It was the song of a guardian who had found his purpose, a spirit who had transformed ancient tragedy into present grace, a soul who had discovered that the greatest freedom came not from escaping responsibility, but from embracing it completely. And in that song, barely audible but unmistakably present, Kenji could hear the voices of 7 children who no longer waited in the cold, their laughter finally free to echo across the eternal snows.